Welcome, you are settling into a moment of quiet. Perhaps you are already lying in bed, or simply letting the day fade from your thoughts. Tonight, I will take you on a journey into the past, into the winding roads, cobbled paths, and sacred destinations of the medieval world. We will walk beside pilgrims, those ordinary men and women of centuries long ago, who traveled across fields, mountains, and seas. Their footsteps echoed in dirt roads and cloisters, in bustling markets and silent chapels. Some walked out of deep faith, others were driven by hope for healing, or by duty, or even by curiosity. Their lives were different from yours, yet in some ways comfort, fatigue, the search for meaning, they were not so different at all. Tonight, we will explore what it truly meant to take a pilgrimage. We will begin by looking at the daily experiences of a pilgrim. The small discomforts, the meals, the blisters, and the long hours on the road. Then, we will turn to the story of a single pilgrim destination, Canterbury, and the life and death of Thomas Becket. After that, we will explore the strange and often puzzling world of relics, those sacred bones and objects that pilgrims sought with such devotion. Finally, we will step quietly into the great cathedrals of Europe, gazing upward at their soaring vaults, and considering what it felt like to stand in their vast silence. All of this is history, yes, but tonight it is also a kind of lullaby. I will guide you slowly, calmly, through these worlds of stone and dust, of prayer and hardship, so that your mind can wander gently, and, if it wishes, drift into sleep. So let us begin with the life of the pilgrim on the road. The pilgrim's life was, at its heart, a life of uncertainty. Each morning began with the same question: how far can I go today? There were no maps in every pocket, no certain timetable, no easy knowledge of where the next bed or meal might appear. Pilgrims relied on word of mouth. A fellow traveler might say, "There is a monastery 1 day's walk from here," or a farmer might mention a market town up the road, but the distance was always uncertain. A day's walk could mean 10 miles, or 20. The body adjusted, slowly. Muscles grew used to the ache, though never entirely free of it. A pilgrim's stride was marked by the staff that clicked rhythmically on stone and soil. Some pilgrims tied bells or shells to their cloaks, both as a badge of identity and as a sound of reassurance, a faint jingling that said, "I am not alone." Not every pilgrim traveled on foot. Those with some wealth might hire a mule or even a horse, though these animals needed feeding and stabling, and were prone to illness or theft. Boats were sometimes used to cross rivers or coastal stretches, but these voyages were small, vulnerable things. A sudden storm could delay or even wreck the craft. Sea voyages in particular were dreaded. Pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela, who sailed from England or France, faced long, crowded crossings, where seasickness mingled with prayers, and fear of drowning was never far away. At night, lodging was as unpredictable as the day's march. Monasteries along main routes often opened their doors. Hospitality was part of their duty, and pilgrims might be given a pallet of straw, a bowl of soup, and the comfort of chanting monks at dawn. Yet monasteries could not always take everyone. If their halls were full, pilgrims sought out taverns, barns, or simple huts. A few carried small tents or blankets, making a bed on the ground. Imagine lying there, cloak wrapped around you, the stars above bright and unblinking, the night air sharp against your skin. Dogs might bark in the distance, an owl might call. The sounds of the medieval night were familiar to them, yet strange to us. Food, when available, was humble. Bread was the constant companion. Dark, heavy, coarse bread, often mixed with rye or barley. Sometimes pilgrims chewed on dried fish, salted to last the journey, its flavor sharp and briny. On lucky evenings, stew was served in a communal pot, flavored with turnips, leeks, or beans. Each region offered something slightly different: garlic in France, olives in Spain, onions in England, but across Europe, the pilgrim's meal was modest and always uncertain. Hunger was a familiar sensation, tolerated with quiet endurance. The dangers were not just physical. There were taxes and tolls at bridges and city gates. Officials demanded payment for safe passage. Some were fair, others took advantage of weary travelers. Pilgrims often carried letters of recommendation from priests or lords to prove their honesty, but such papers were not always respected. There were also dangers from nature itself. In forests, wolves still roamed in some regions. In the Alps, snow and cold threatened travelers bound for Rome. In the Pyrenees, winds cut across the mountain paths toward Compostela. Flooded rivers could delay entire groups 4 days, waiting for the waters to recede. Yet, despite all hardship, there was also a rhythm of small joys. Imagine a village festival encountered by chance bright cloth banners, musicians with flutes, the smell of roasting meat drifting through the square. Pilgrims might pause, welcomed by locals, joining in a feast before resuming the long march, or imagine the relief of a warm bath in a public bathhouse, though rare and often crowded, offering a moment of cleansing, a weeks on the road. Pilgrims carried symbols of their journey, tokens that both marked them out and offered protection. The scallop shell was most famous, especially for those bound for Santiago. Others carried small lead badges from shrines, pinned to their cloaks or hats. These trinkets were both souvenirs and proof. I have walked, I have prayed, I have come this far. And in the evenings, when pilgrims gathered, stories passed from one to another. Tales of miracles at distant shrines, warnings of dangerous routes, jests, songs, and quiet prayers. In these moments, the pilgrimage was not only hardship, but also community. Strangers became companions. Companions became a small, temporary family. For some, pilgrimage was a penance. A priest might sentence a thief, or an adulterer, or even a murderer to walk to a shrine as a form of spiritual punishment. For others, pilgrimage was a vow, a promise made during sickness or war. If I live, I will walk to Compostela. And for still others, it was an adventure, a chance to see lands beyond their village, to glimpse great cities and churches spoken of only in stories. But whatever the reason, the reality was the same: the aching feet, the long roads, the constant negotiation between discomfort and devotion. And yet, imagine reaching the crest of a hill and seeing, at last, the spire of a cathedral rising in the distance. A tower of stone against the sky, a promise that the journey had meaning. For many pilgrims, that sight alone brought tears. The pain of blisters, the hunger of empty days, the fear of thieves, all of it seemed to wash away when the shrine finally appeared. This was the pilgrim's life, a pattern of discomforts endured for a hope that was greater than the sum of all hardships. A hope that healing, forgiveness, or grace waited at the end of the road. And so, as the weary pilgrims pressed on, step after step, their stories became part of the great tapestry of the Middle Ages. Their road was not easy. It was exhausting, dangerous, and strange, and yet it was also meaningful, a bridge between the earthly and the sacred. And now, with this understanding of their daily walk, we can turn to one of the most famous shrines in medieval Europe. The shrine of a man whose life and death turned an English cathedral into one of the busiest pilgrimage sites of the age, the shrine of Thomas Becket, in Canterbury. Imagine yourself standing in the quiet nave of Canterbury Cathedral. The air is cool and still. Sunlight filters in through tall stained glass windows, casting coloured patches on the stone floor. It is peaceful here, but beneath this peace lies a story of conflict, loyalty, betrayal, and faith. A story that drew countless pilgrims to this very place. This is the story of Thomas Becket. Thomas was not born into greatness. He came into the world in London, around the year 1119, the son of a merchant. His family was comfortable, but not noble. As a young man, Thomas was educated by churchmen and trained in the ways of administration. He was clever, ambitious, and skilled at handling both people and paperwork. These were the qualities that brought him to the attention of powerful men. In time, Thomas became close to King Henry, II of England. The two men could not have seemed more different. Henry was fiery, impulsive, and forceful. Thomas was refined, careful, and deliberate, yet they became friends. The king saw in Thomas a man he could trust, and so he raised him higher and higher in office. Eventually, Henry made him Chancellor of England, one of the most powerful positions in the realm. 4 years, the two men worked side by side. They dined together, hunted together, and governed together. The friendship was close enough that some chroniclers describe them almost as brothers. Henry believed that Thomas would always serve him, no matter what. But in 1162, the Archbishop of Canterbury died. This was the highest church office in England, second only to the Pope himself. Henry saw an opportunity. If he placed his trusted friend in this role, then surely the church would be loyal to the crown. And so, Thomas Becket was chosen to be Archbishop. At first, Henry expected nothing to change. But the moment Thomas put on the robes of his new office, he seemed to become a different man. Where once he had been the king's loyal servant, now he became the church's defender. He resigned his position as Chancellor. He adopted a strict, austere way of life, giving up luxuries. He argued fiercely for the independence of the church from royal control. Henry was stunned. This was not the Thomas he thought he knew. The king wanted to control the church courts, to bring priests under the same law as ordinary men, but Thomas refused. He believed that church authority came from God, and no king should interfere with it. The friendship fractured into rivalry. Arguments turned into open hostility. Henry tried to pressure Thomas, to strip him of power, even to exile him. 4 years, Thomas lived abroad, in France, supported by the Pope. Yet he never gave in. He held firm to the idea that the church must remain free of the king's hand. Eventually, in 1170, Thomas returned to England. At first, there was hope for peace. But quickly, tensions flared again. Henry grew furious. According to chroniclers, one evening, the king cried out in rage, words to the effect of, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" Whether Henry truly meant for what followed is uncertain, but 4 knights, hearing their king's frustration, rode to Canterbury. They entered the cathedral where Thomas was at prayer. Calmly, Thomas refused to flee. He stood before the altar, surrounded by monks. And there, in that sacred space, the knights struck him down. The murder shocked Christendom. To kill an archbishop in a cathedral was unthinkable. Thomas Becket was no longer just a man. He became a martyr. Almost immediately, stories of miracles began to spread. Pilgrims claimed that prayers at Becket's tomb brought healing. The sick recovered, the lame walked, the blind regained sight. Word of these wonders travelled quickly, and soon pilgrims began to pour into Canterbury from across England and from far beyond its borders. Within just 3 years, the Pope declared Thomas Becket a saint. His shrine in Canterbury Cathedral became one of the greatest pilgrimage sites in Europe, rivaling Compostela and Rome. Imagine now the pilgrims who walked the roads of England toward Canterbury. Some came from nearby villages, bringing candles to burn at the shrine. Others came from distant lands, carrying gifts of gold or silver. At the cathedral, they entered barefoot, kneeling before the tomb. They might press close against it, hoping to carry home a fragment of its holiness. Some bought small lead badges stamped with the image of Becket, tokens of their journey. The shrine itself grew rich, donations poured in. Canterbury became a centre not only of devotion, but also of wealth. Pilgrims filled the town's inns, markets, and streets, their footsteps wearing smooth the stone floors of the cathedral. Even in death, Thomas Becket and King Henry II remained bound together. Henry, struck by guilt, performed a public penance. He walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and allowed monks to lash him with whips at the martyr's tomb. The sight was extraordinary, a king humbling himself before a man he once called friend. Centuries later, Becket's story still lingered. Pilgrims continued to walk to Canterbury, their journeys immortalized in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, a collection of stories told by travellers on their way to Becket's shrine. Each tale was a reminder of how deeply his death had shaped the medieval imagination, and so, the shrine of Thomas Becket became a beacon. It stood as a symbol of defiance, of faith, of the tension between crown and church. It was also a place of comfort for ordinary people who sought healing, forgiveness, and connection with the divine. When you picture the long road of the pilgrim, with its blisters and its hardships, it is easier to understand their persistence when you see what awaited them, not just a shrine of stone and candles, but the memory of a man who stood his ground against a king, and who paid the price for it. The story of Thomas Becket is but one part of the larger mystery of medieval pilgrimage. For behind every shrine, there were relics, bones, garments, splinters of the cross, objects believed to hold divine power. These relics were as much a part of the journeys as the roads themselves. And so, let us turn next to these strange, sacred objects, and the role they played in the pilgrim's experience. Imagine entering a dimly lit chapel, where the air is thick with incense. Candles flicker against carved stone, casting shadows that make the saints on the walls seem alive. Before you stands a reliquary, a container of gold, or silver, or sometimes simple wood. Within it, the faithful believe, lies something extraordinary, perhaps the bone of a saint, perhaps a fragment of the true cross, perhaps a vial of holy blood. In the Middle Ages, relics were at the very heart of pilgrimage. To touch them, or even to gaze upon them, was thought to bring blessings, forgiveness, or healing. For many pilgrims, the relic was the destination itself. Relics were divided into classes. The first class were the physical remains of saints, bones, hair, teeth, or drops of blood. The second class were objects that had belonged to saints, a cloak, a staff, or even a book. The third class were objects touched to those relics, tokens carrying a trace of their holiness. Each had value, though the closer to the saint's body, the greater the reverence. One of the greatest treasures in Europe was said to be the bones of St. James, resting at Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Pilgrims walked across mountains and rivers to kneel before them. In Rome, the bodies of Peter and Paul lay enshrined, making the eternal city a magnet for pilgrims. In Jerusalem, fragments of the cross of Christ, thorns from the crown, and the stone of the Holy Sepulchre drew pilgrims from across Christendom. Yet relics were not only in distant lands. Almost every town had something it called holy. A church might claim a finger bone of a local saint. A monastery might guard a vial of oil, said to flow from a martyr's tomb. These local relics gave small communities their place in the sacred geography of Europe. The experience of seeing a relic could be overwhelming. Pilgrims often approached on their knees. Some touched the reliquary with cloths, carrying those cloths home as secondary relics. Others left offerings of coins, wax, or jewelry in gratitude. Chroniclers wrote of the sick rising from their beds, of the blind gaining sight, of fevers lifting in the presence of relics. Whether these miracles were true or not, they shaped the pilgrim's journey, filling it with hope. But there was also mystery, and sometimes doubt. Europe was filled with relics, so many that skeptics quietly wondered how they could all be genuine. There were enough fragments of the true cross, some said, to build a ship. Multiple churches claimed to have the head of John the Baptist. Saints seemed to multiply, their bones appearing in more than one place. The medieval mind was less troubled by these contradictions than we might expect. Faith did not always require strict logic. To hold a relic was to touch something beyond the ordinary, something that bound earth to heaven. Even if there were too many fragments, the meaning of them remained. Still, fraud existed. Relic dealers travelled, offering bones of saints for a price. Some were the bones of animals, carved or wrapped in silk. Others were ordinary objects declared holy with little proof. Yet the church itself, at times, turned a blind eye. Relics drew pilgrims. Pilgrims brought donations. and donations built cathedrals, funded monasteries, and sustained entire towns. Relics were not only displayed in churches, sometimes they traveled. When famine struck, a relic might be carried in procession through fields to bless the crops. When plague spread, relics were paraded through city streets, their presence thought to drive out disease. These processions were both spiritual and communal, offering comfort in times of fear. And so relics became anchors of faith. They gave physical form to belief. For people who lived in a world of hardship and uncertainty, relics offered reassurance that holiness was not only distant, but present, tangible, and near at hand. Imagine yourself as a pilgrim. After weeks of walking, you arrive at a shrine. Your feet ache, your body is tired, your clothes are worn. And then, you kneel before a reliquary. Perhaps it is a golden chest, adorned with jewels, gleaming in candlelight. Perhaps it is simple, a small glass vial holding what is said to be a drop of blood. Whatever it is, in that moment, you feel you have reached the heart of your journey. The object before you is more than what it appears. It is a window into the sacred. The mystery of relics was not in proving their authenticity. It was in the experience of devotion, in the quiet belief that through them, the divine touched the human world. For pilgrims, relics gave meaning to every blister, every weary mile. They made the hardships of the road worthwhile. But the pilgrimage did not end at the relic. For often, these sacred objects were housed in places that inspired awe on their own. The great Gothic cathedrals, with their soaring arches and stained glass, were as much a part of the experience as the relics themselves. And so, in our final segment, we will step inside those cathedrals. We will look upward at the ribbed vaults, walk slowly down echoing aisles, and imagine the world of ritual and grandeur that embraced the pilgrim at journey's end. When we think of relics, it is easy to imagine only great treasures in famous cathedrals, but the truth is that relics existed on every level of medieval life. From the grandest shrines in Rome and Santiago to the humblest village parish, relics connected communities to the sacred. Consider the local church in a small medieval town. Perhaps its most prized possession was a single fragment of cloth, said to have been touched to the bones of a saint. It might be displayed only once a year, on the feast day of that saint. On that day, the townspeople would gather, candles in hand, to process through the streets, following their priest who carried the relic high above the crowd. For them, that tiny object was every bit as important as the grand relics in distant cities. Other relics were tied to everyday life. Farmers prayed before relics when rain was scarce or when storms threatened their harvests. Sailors carried relics on their voyages, believing that a saint's protection would guard them against storms. Soldiers, too, sometimes took small relics into battle, tucked into pouches or worn on chains, a reminder of divine presence amid danger. The containers of these relics were often works of art in themselves. Reliquaries were made to inspire awe. Some were fashioned as golden boxes studded with gems. Others were shaped like the body part they contained, a silver arm holding a saint's arm bone, or a golden head housing a skull. Some were made of crystal, so that the faithful could glimpse the relic inside. Imagine the way light played across such objects in candlelit chapels, glimmering and shifting as pilgrims moved around them. But not every relic was displayed so openly. Some were hidden deep within altars. In fact, it was customary that every altar contain a relic sealed within it, a reminder that worship was always connected to the saints. This meant that even in the simplest village chapel, worshippers knelt above the bones of holy men and women, though they never saw them directly. Pilgrims often brought back small souvenirs known as pilgrim badges. These were made of lead or pewter and bore the symbol of the shrine they had visited. A badge from Canterbury might bear the image of Thomas Becket. One from Compostela often carried the scallop shell. These badges were sewn onto cloaks or hats, turning the pilgrims' very clothing into a story of their journey. Each badge was a quiet testimony. I was there. I touched the relic. I received its blessing. It is worth remembering how powerful such experiences felt in a world where life was short and uncertain. Disease, famine, and violence were constant shadows. The idea that a sunset's power could reach into the human world offered comfort that cannot be easily measured. Even the smallest relic was a reminder that heaven was not distant, but near, and that the lives of holy men and women continued to shape the present. There were also relics that stirred controversy even in their own time. Some, like the holy foreskin of Christ, were objects of an easy fascination, claimed by multiple churches. Others, like the heads of saints, were carried from city to city as trophies, especially during wars. When one city conquered another, taking its relics was a way of claiming not only wealth, but spiritual authority. This led to a phenomenon known as furta sacra, the holy theft of relics. Stories tell of monks or knights stealing relics from one place and carrying them to another. Sometimes the theft was justified as divine will, the saint choosing a new resting place. Other times, it was simply opportunistic. These tales remind us that relics were not only sacred, but also political. They could elevate a town into a center of pilgrimage, bringing both prestige and wealth. Yet for the pilgrim before a reliquary, none of this mattered. The authenticity, the politics, the disputes, these faded away. What remained was the feeling of standing in the presence of something holy, something greater than themselves. Imagine a woman who has walked 4 weeks, hoping for a healing for her child. She kneels, places a coin on the altar, and touches a cloth to the reliquary. She believes that through this act, her prayers rise more swiftly to heaven. Imagine a farmer, weary from toil, asking for protection over his fields. Or a knight, scarred from battle, laying down his sword to pray for forgiveness. Each encounter with a relic was personal, intimate, and filled with quiet hope. And whether or not the relic was real, it carried power, because belief itself gave it meaning. Relics, then, were not simply bones and objects. They were bridges between worlds, the earthly and the divine, the ordinary and the eternal. They shaped the landscape of Europe, filling it with shrines, chapels, and cathedrals that stood as beacons for travelers. And it was in those cathedrals, vast and echoing, that relics often rested. Their presence was magnified by the grandeur of the buildings that housed them. Pilgrims not only sought relics, they entered spaces designed to lift the heart upward, toward heaven itself. So now, let us step quietly inside one of those cathedrals. Let us feel the cool stone beneath our feet, hear the echo of chanting voices, and look upward at soaring arches that seem to reach into the clouds. When pilgrims arrived at a cathedral, weary from the road, they often felt as though they had stepped into another world. Outside was the noise of the town, the market stalls, the clatter of hooves on stone streets, the cries of merchants. But crossing the threshold of a Gothic cathedral was like stepping into silence, into air that felt different, cooler, hushed, filled with the faint smell of incense and old stone. The Gothic cathedral was not simply a building, it was a sermon made of stone and glass. Every line, every arch, every window was meant to teach, to lift the mind and soul toward heaven. Unlike the squat, heavy Romanesque churches that came before, Gothic cathedrals soared. Their walls rose higher, their arches pointed heavenward, and their ceilings seemed to vanish into shadows above. The effect was deliberate, to make human beings feel small, yet connected to something infinitely vast. One of the most striking features of these cathedrals was the stained glass. Imagine the sun pouring through enormous windows, filling the interior with colors that shifted and danced with the hours of the day. Blues as deep as the sea, reds as rich as wine, golds that shimmered like firelight. To medieval people, who lived in a world of muted tones, earth, wood, wool, and stone, this explosion of color was overwhelming. It was as if heaven itself had opened above them, pouring light down into their lives. The windows told stories, too. For many who could not read, stained glass was their Bible. Scenes of Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, the life of Christ, the miracles of St. Saul unfolded in panels of light. Each window was like a page, teaching through images. Children might stand before them, tracing the figures with wide eyes, while priests explained the lessons to their flock. High above, stone figures gazed down. Gargoyles crouched on the edges of the roof, their grotesque shapes reminding the faithful of evil forces lurking beyond the sanctuary of the church. Some believed they were guardians, keeping demons at bay. Others saw them as warnings, reminders of the darkness outside the light of God. Inside, saints and angels carved into pillars seemed to watch over worshippers. Their faces, serene or stern, were like silent teachers, always present. The architecture itself was an act of faith. Builders employed flying buttresses, great stone arms that reached outward, supporting the walls and allowing them to be thinner, taller, filled with glass. It was engineering born of devotion, each calculation a prayer in stone. Construction often lasted for centuries. A mason might spend his entire life carving blocks for a cathedral he would never see finished. His son might take up the same work, and his grandson after him. To build a cathedral was to join a chain that stretched across generations, each worker adding his piece to a vision larger than himself. Inside, the vastness could feel both comforting and overwhelming. Candles flickered before altars. Choirs sang, their voices echoing, rising, intertwining with the very stones. The sound of organ pipes rumbled like thunder, then softened into a whisper. It was a place where human senses were filled to their edges: sight, sound, smell, and touch, all drawn upward to the divine. And always, in the heart of the cathedral, was the relic, whether displayed in a golden shrine or hidden deep within the altar. The relic was the quiet soul of the building. Pilgrims came not only to marvel at the architecture, but to kneel, to pray, to believe. The cathedral wrapped that relic in layers of beauty, making the entire structure a vessel for holiness. Each cathedral had its own character. At Chartres, the glass glows with an otherworldly blue. At Notre Dame of Paris, the towers rise like watchful sentinels over the city. At Cologne, the sheer scale overwhelms, every inch carved and adorned. Each one spoke with its own voice, yet all shared the same language of faith in stone. For the medieval pilgrim, to stand inside a cathedral was to feel the nearness of heaven. For us, centuries later, the feeling lingers. Even in silence, even when the crowds are gone, these spaces speak. They remind us that human hands can shape not only tools and weapons, but beauty meant to lift hearts above the troubles of earth, if only for a moment. For pilgrims and townsfolk alike, the cathedral was not only a house of prayer, but the very heart of community life. Its great doors stood open from morning until night, and within those walls, daily rhythms unfolded as steadily as the rising and setting of the sun. At dawn, the first prayers, matins, and lauds echoed in the half-darkness. The clergy, wrapped in heavy cloaks, shuffled into the choir stalls, their voices carrying softly into the cold air. Few people came at such an early hour. The cathedral seemed to belong only to monks, canons, and the unseen God, but as the morning wore on, townsfolk began to arrive. Merchants knelt briefly before opening their shops. Mothers whispered prayers for children, and travelers paused before setting out on the roads. The cathedral was also a calendar in stone. Its bells marked not only the hours, but the feasts, fasts, and solemn days that ordered medieval life. On feast days, the building overflowed with people, incense thickened the air, banners unfurled, candles multiplied, and choirs sang with such force that the walls seemed alive with sound. For Christmas, greenery was hung about the nave. For Easter, lilac spilled over the altars. Each holy day transformed the cathedral into a stage where drama and devotion met. Yet not all was solemn. The square before the cathedral often bustled with activity: traders, storytellers, jugglers, beggars. Inside, children sometimes slipped away from parents, chasing one another around columns, until a stern canon sent them back. Cats, too, wandered freely, sometimes fed by the clergy, sometimes tolerated as mousers. The cathedral was sacred, but it was not sealed off from the life of the town. It was woven into it. Work also continued daily inside. Stonemasons might still be carving chapels long after the nave was complete, the tapping of their chisels mixing with prayers. Glaziers climbed scaffolding to repair cracked panes of stained glass. Candle makers replenished wax for the hundreds of tapers that burned at shrines. It was not unusual to hear the hum of labor within the sacred hush. At the center of everything was the Mass. When the great bronze bells called the faithful, the cathedral filled, and the ritual began. The priest at the altar spoke in Latin, words many could not understand, yet the gestures and rhythm were familiar to all. The ringing of the small Sanctus bell at the moment of consecration drew every eye to the altar. In that instant, silence fell even on restless children. For a heartbeat, it seemed that heaven itself had come down upon the altar stone. Music was another soul of the cathedral. Gregorian chant, flowing like water, was the constant soundscape of worship. In great centers like Notre Dame of Paris, polyphony began to bloom, 2 or 3 voices weaving together, creating harmonies that felt like new architecture in sound. Pilgrims sometimes spoke of leaving a cathedral not with visions, but with melodies ringing in their hearts. There were also places for the private soul. Chapels tucked along the sides offered quiet space for whispered prayers. Pilgrims lit candles before relics, leaving coins or tokens of gratitude. Some left objects behind, crutches, bandages, or small carved offerings, testimonies of healings or hopes. In these small corners, the cathedral became intimate, a place for the single heart, not just the gathered crowd. As evening drew near, the final prayers, vespers, filled the fading light. Stained glass windows darkened into shadows, candles flared brighter, and the vastness of the cathedral seemed to settle into rest. For those who lingered, perhaps a lone pilgrim resting against a column, it was a moment of deep peace. The world outside would call again tomorrow, with its noise and hardship, but within those stone walls, for a few hours, time itself felt suspended. And so, day after day, year after year, century after century, the life of the cathedral unfolded. It was a place of ritual and wonder, of community and solitude, of great celebrations and quiet prayers. To enter was to step into a rhythm older and larger than any single life, a rhythm that still lingers, even now, in the stones that remain. The Middle Ages were an age of movement, though most people never travelled far from their birthplace. Yet there was one kind of journey that drew men and women across fields, forests, mountains, and seas: the pilgrimage. To take up the pilgrim's staff was to leave behind the familiar and walk into uncertainty, guided by faith, fear, and the hope of blessing. For some, pilgrimage began as a vow. A sick child might be healed, and the family promised to visit the shrine of a saint in gratitude. A knight, surviving battle, might pledge to walk barefoot to Compostela. Others went in penance. Thieves, adulterers, or even nobles guilty of bloodshed, commanded by priests to undertake a long road as their confession and penance in motion. And for many, pilgrimage was less about punishment than yearning, a desire to draw nearer to God, to seek protection, or to find meaning in suffering. The roads soon revealed their double nature. They could be dangerous, filled with bandits, harsh weather, and sickness. Travelers often fell ill, their food spoiled, their purses stolen. Yet those same roads also knit Christendom together. Pilgrims shared bread, songs, and prayers, walking in groups for safety. Inns and hospices sprouted along major routes, run by monks or laymen, where pilgrims might rest, eat, and wash dust from their feet. The journey itself became a kind of moving community, strangers bound by a single goal. There were great destinations known across Europe. To Rome, pilgrims went to the tombs of Peter and Paul, to venerate relics and seek indulgences. To Santiago de Compostela in Spain, they walked to honor St. James, the apostle, whose bones were believed to rest at the end of the world's western road. Jerusalem, the holiest of all, drew the most daring, for the journey was long and fraught with peril, crossing seas and hostile lands. Closer to home, shrines like Canterbury in England or Vézelay in France welcomed multitudes, their relics offering comfort without the danger of distant travel. The pilgrim's dress was distinctive, a broad-brimmed hat, a long cloak, a staff in hand, and often a scallop shell, the badge of Santiago pinned to their cloak or hat. These signs marked the traveller as one under God's protection. In theory, pilgrims were to be spared violence, though in practice they often fell prey to thieves who cared little for holy symbols. Still, the very sight of a pilgrim inspired respect among townsfolk, who offered alms or lodging to aid their journey. Pilgrimage was also a deeply physical prayer. Each blister, each aching step, each night of hunger became part of the offering to God. Some pilgrims went barefoot, others dragged chains behind them, some even crawled on hands and knees, the last stretch to a shrine. Their bodies became their devotion, writing prayers upon the dust of the road. And yet, pilgrimage was not all pain. Many found joy in the freedom of the road, the songs sung around fires, the stories traded among strangers, the sudden kindness of a farmer offering bread. Pilgrimage opened horizons. It let a peasant from Normandy walk alongside a noble from Burgundy, both sharing the same dust and the same hope. On the road, all were pilgrims first, social ranks blurred under the weight of shared hardship. When at last the destination was reached, the reward was often overwhelming. To kneel before a saint's shrine, to touch the stone of a tomb, to press lips to a reliquary, it was to feel heaven close. Many wept openly, laying down coins or tokens, leaving behind the burdens they had carried. Some swore their lives were changed, others returned home the same, but with a deeper peace. The return journey, though often overlooked, was also part of the pilgrimage. Pilgrims carried home not only souvenirs, badges, shells, or relics, but also stories, songs, and wisdom gathered from fellow travelers. Entire villages might gather to hear the tale of a man who had knelt in Rome or touched the shrine at Compostela. Pilgrims became carriers of faith, culture, and news, knitting the vast expanse of medieval Europe together like threads in a living tapestry. To go on pilgrimage, then, was not simply to move from one place to another. It was to enter a great river of devotion that carried countless souls along its flow. The roads to Canterbury, to Santiago, to Rome, to Jerusalem were more than paths of stone. They were arteries of belief, lifelines of a world that sought God not only in prayer, but also in motion. If the pilgrim's road was the outward journey of medieval faith, the cloister was its inward turning. Behind high walls, within stone abbeys and monasteries, men and women devoted their lives not to wandering but to stillness, silence, and the labor of the mind and spirit. Monks were the keepers of knowledge in a world where most people could not read or write. Their lives followed a strict rhythm, set by the ringing of bells, matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, the day unfolding in cycles of prayer, work, and study. Silence was often required. Speech was measured, and every hour was to be offered to God. Yet within this quiet discipline, one of the greatest treasures of the medieval world, the preservation and transmission of learning. At the heart of the monastery stood the scriptorium, a chamber where manuscripts were copied by hand. In the dim light of candles or narrow windows, monks bent over desks, quills in hand, copying letter by letter the words of Scripture, the writings of the Church Fathers, and even the works of pagan philosophers like Aristotle or Cicero. These texts were precious. Parchment was costly, ink laboriously made, and a single Bible could take years to complete. The work was painstaking, but it was seen as holy. Each word copied was a prayer, each illuminated letter a hymn to God. The margins of manuscripts sometimes revealed the human side of the scribes, complaints of cold fingers, notes about hunger, even small jokes, yet the outcome of their devotion was magnificent. Some books were adorned with gold leaf, brilliant colors, and intricate illustrations, true masterpieces of medieval art, known as illuminated manuscripts. Through this work, monasteries became the guardians of Western knowledge. When empires collapsed and cities burned, the cloisters held fast to fragile memory. Ancient Greek thought, Roman law, Christian theology all survived because monks carefully transcribed them, ensuring that they would not vanish in the chaos of war and time. But the monastic world was not only about copying. Monasteries became centers of education. Boys sent to be trained, as novices often learned to read and write. Noble families placed their sons in abbeys to receive instruction. Some monasteries, especially in Ireland, England, and later France, grew into great schools. Monks studied astronomy, medicine, and mathematics alongside theology. Their libraries grew into vast treasuries, drawing scholars from afar. The rhythm of monastic life also shaped the wider medieval world. Monks introduced methods of farming, drainage, and brewing. They cultivated vineyards, improved ploughs, and spread techniques of architecture. They were not isolated dreamers, but active builders of society, their knowledge spilling beyond cloister walls. There were different orders, each with its own character. The Benedictines, following the rule of St. Benedict, emphasized stability and moderation. The Cistercians, stern reformers, sought simplicity and austerity, their abbeys rising in remote valleys. The Cluniacs, by contrast, glorified the liturgy with elaborate chants and rich decoration. Later, the mendicant orders, the Franciscans and Dominicans, took learning and preaching out into the streets, living among the people rather than behind walls. Yet in every form, the monastic vocation was tied to the written word. Manuscripts were the lifeblood of their culture. Through them, the Bible spoke, prayers were preserved, saints' lives were recorded, and even medicine and science were codified. A single book could embody the labor of generations, its pages a bridge across centuries. In time, monasteries gave birth to something even greater, the university. Out of cathedral schools and monastic teaching grew centers of learning in Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and beyond. There, knowledge passed from cloisters to scholars, shaping a broader world. The slow scratching of quills in cold scriptoriums laid the foundation for Europe's intellectual rebirth. Thus, the monks, in their quiet discipline, were not only servants of God, but also unwitting architects of civilization. In their manuscripts lived the memory of antiquity, the voice of the Church, and the seeds of a future that would one day awaken into new light. The Middle Ages were not a single tale, but a woven fabric of lives, beliefs, and struggles. From the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, to the relics carried by pilgrims, to the soaring vaults of Gothic cathedrals, and the quiet labor of monks in their scriptoria, the medieval world revealed a singular truth. Faith was not an ornament, it was the center of existence. The pilgrim walking dusty roads, the mason carving stone angels high above the streets, the monk bending over a manuscript by candlelight, all lived in a universe where the visible world was only half of reality. The unseen heaven, hell, the presence of saints was just as real as the marketplace or the plough. Life was fragile, death ever near. And yet people sought meaning not in despair, but in devotion, in beauty, and in knowledge. The relics of saints were not only bones in golden shrines, but anchors of hope. The cathedrals, with their light-filled windows, were not only buildings, but visions of heaven in stone. The manuscripts were not merely books, but vessels of memory, bearing the wisdom of ages into the future. And the roads of pilgrims were not just journeys, but acts of trust, steps taken toward eternity. From this world, our own has inherited much. The very shape of cities, the foundations of law, the rhythms of universities, and even the stories we tell are rooted in the soil of the Middle Ages. What seemed, to later ages, as darkness, was in truth a time of quiet light, fragile, flickering, but enduring. In every relic, in every vaulted arch, in every illuminated page, the voices of the past still speak. They remind us that humanity is always searching, whether through faith, through art, or through learning for something greater than itself. The medieval world teaches us that beauty and devotion can flourish even in hardship, and that memory, once preserved, can outlast empires. Thus, when we look upon the ruins of an abbey, the spire of a cathedral, or the yellowed page of a manuscript, we do not see only the past. We see a continuity, a living thread, stretching from those who prayed and built and copied to ourselves. Their world has not vanished, it lingers in ours. And so the story ends where it began, with human beings seeking meaning in stone, in word, in pilgrimage, in prayer. The medieval centuries, for all their struggles, carved a legacy that endures, a legacy of faith, of learning, and of memory that whispers still, if we pause to listen.